Daniel Salter was a Chief Master Sergeant with the US Air Force, and after a 20-year career with the Air Force, he went to the National Reconnaissance Office and got to work on top-secret projects involving UFOs and was exposed to the extraterrestrial phenomenon. He was a Disclosure Project witness, and he was part of the book that was released by Dr. Stephen Greer in 2001. And I'm with his two grandsons who are going to tell us the backstory about Daniel Salter and walk us through some of the documents he put out into the general public and discussed as genuine and as exposing what was really happening concerning extraterrestrial life and technology.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, welcome, Derek and Daniel, to Exopolitics Today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Well, your grandfather, Daniel Salter, he achieved very high rank in the Air Force. I mean, Chief Master Sergeant, which is an E9. That's the highest you can go as a non-commissioned officer. So he definitely was someone who achieved prominence. So how did you kind of get interested in his career, finding out about the projects he was involved in? And tell us a little bit about your backgrounds as well.
Yeah, Derek and I we're both mechanical engineers. We were born and raised in Virginia, and our grandfather, he lived in Texas and New Mexico as we were growing up. So we saw him, usually on summer vacations. Sometimes we would, as teenagers, we would go out there and see him on our own during the summertime. And my first exposure to his career was when I was a teenager in the mid-90s. I spent some time with him, and one day he showed me a lot of interesting information that really blew my mind, talking about UFO technology, extraterrestrials, the fact that we have contact with them, and the government's involvement with them. And it definitely piqued my curiosity. That's the only person I ever talked to about anything like that. So it was very, I kept it to myself is what I'm trying to say, for a long time, because it's not something a lot of people believe. And it wasn't until I found out he was in a disclosure project with Dr. Stephen Greer in 2001, and then he came out with his book, Life with the Cosmos Clearance, that I started to understand the validation of what he was telling me. And it really got me interested in learning more and trying to uncover more behind the scenes of what was really going on. He passed away in the early 2000s, shortly after his book came out. So we didn't have a lot of time to really talk to him more about that, for him to elaborate on these things. But that was my introduction to it, and what piqued my interest in this, kept me over the past 20 years really diving into this material. And as more corroborating stuff comes out, it just kind of leads me down different directions of understanding the real truth of what our government's been doing with the UFO situation.
Anything you want to add, Derek?
Yeah, I can just add briefly. I can tell you, I know that our grandfather did speak probably more directly with my brother. He's 4 years older than me. And just our backgrounds, by the way, we're both mechanical engineers, and we work in the corporate world now. So I mean, we just went through a very normal life. We do remember him talking about the UFOs and alien subject quite a bit when we were younger. And I remember the first time he came out to us was when I was about 10. It was 1993, and he sat us down, and my mom said, "Hey, your grandfather has something he wants to tell you." And so he sat us down at the table, and we heard him talk about his first encounter with 3 UFOs while he's working radar tower at Warner Robins Air Force Base. So he briefly talked to us about that. And of course, as a kid, I remember that, and just remember being like, okay, that's nice to know. And then I went back to playing outside. I'm just a kid. I don't know how to really take that information in. what to do with that. But over the years, that's kind of always been the information he had. And like my brother said, we didn't really take it too seriously until we saw that he was part of the Disclosure Project. And I remember being a senior in high school when he came to our house near DC, and my mom said he's that I've got to take your grandfather up to this conference, this event in DC, and we had no idea what that meant until it later became public. So we had no idea he was even involved with Dr. Greer before that, and that he's involved with the book and the testimonies that he did do, until all of that was really come out into the public domain. So that's really why after that point I started to look very much harder into the subject. I ended up inheriting all of his books, his library of information over the years. So I've added to that also myself over the last 20 years, and where the pieces seem to fit. So I feel like I really have gotten to put a story together, but he really helped in leading that direction and finding out the truth. So, yeah.
Well, he reached a very high rank in the Air Force, and you were able to get your hands on some documentation that validates his testimony, because that's one of the things that a lot of people have incredible stories, but very few have documentation backing them up. And in his book, Life with a Cosmos Clearance, amazing information in there. We're going to go through that and talk about some of the documentation. But in his case, you were able to get your hands on some of the documentation, and probably the one that I think is most relevant to my audience is the one showing his retirement as a Chief Master Sergeant. That's an E9 with the US Air Force. And so you actually got your hands on his retirement document. So, yeah, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so it does say, I don't know, Dan, I guess, was that part of the collection of stuff that you've had? We had storage of all of his old things, and my brother went through a lot of it. So
yeah, a lot of documentation of his time in the military, and when he first went in, a lot of his trainings at the beginning of his career, and then his retirement information as well. Unfortunately, we're not able to find the NRO information. I'm sure that was, as being a very highly classified organization, that there was not anything like readily available for us to reference for that. So
yeah, but that's the one thing I was going to mention, that he claimed within the book that license plate that he had was a retirement gift from the NRO, and it had that scientific phenomenon technical unit, that Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, which was one of those names that comes up early on in the UFO field in the community, that just anything on the UFO topic within the intelligence agency. So apparently that is real, supposedly a real piece of from that.
Right, and clearly the National Reconnaissance Office was interested in your grandfather because of his very senior rank and expertise in the Air Force. We know that these covert projects, they recruit the cream of the crop. They recruit the most talented people in the military, in the corporate world, for these classified projects. And your grandfather was one of those. I mean, reaching an E9 Chief Master Sergeant is a very difficult thing to do. He was also the chief of the electronics branch of the 31st Air Force Division. And again, this is one of the documents that you passed on to me. So there's a document that shows that he was chief of the electronics branch of the 31st Division. So, and in this document, it refers to him, and it says that he was recommending, quote, policies and plans to ensure maximum coordination, integration, and effectiveness of electronic activities with military, governmental, and civilian agencies. So this, he was responsible at that time for the Midwest in the United States for monitoring electronic activities and coordinating the 31st Air Division with government and civilian agencies. So he would have been in that role. He would have been in the know in terms of these UFO sightings over nuclear sites in the Midwest. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, he claimed to have his first sighting actually in 1949 at the beginning of his career at Warner Robins Air Force Base in Georgia, and they saw three UFOs. His team, when they were running radar there, and they was about a half mile out. They saw these objects just kind of staying in one place, and they went and checked the radar, and they picked them up on the radar as well, so they knew this was a real thing. And then they quickly just shot out and disappeared. And they said the speeds that they were leaving, what they calculated on the radar, was beyond any of the aircraft technology that they had at that time in the military. And that was his first encounter. And from there, he also worked under Benoit Mandelbrot, and he worked on a lot of different technology projects with him, and he gained access to some of the. He first initially gained a crypto access clearance, I believe, and then from there, the information that he knew from these programs and working with these various scientists kind of led him into the path of getting to more highly classified projects and some of the black project type stuff. And it might have had a lot to do with why he went into the NRO after his career, because he did have access to some of this knowledge already.
Yeah, he claimed to work on the Mode 6 transponder in the official capacity within radar electronics, which is like the black box that's in every aircraft. So he claimed that that's where he started really working on projects to that level. So I don't know. We don't know what point he was brought under Benoit Mandelbrot, but if he was working with him, you can imagine what they could have been working on. And he claimed to work on particleization as also a topic other than the UFO topic and ET topic. That's what he called it anyway, which I haven't heard. I haven't really heard that anywhere else.
Well, he was serving in the Air Force at that time when the Air Force was being formed out of the U.S. Army Air Corps. So, I mean, he, I think, began in June of 1947 and retired in 1969 from the Air Force after a 22-year career. And of course, the UFO phenomenon was very prominent over nuclear missile sites, starting with the Roswell incident in July of 1947. So he had just joined the Air Force at that time, or part of the Army Air Corps at that time. And so this would have been, I guess, a way for him to kind of like learn about this phenomenon throughout his career, because it seems that his career with electronic communications, intelligence, would have overlapped with these UFOs kind of like appearing next to these nuclear missile sites that just grew up over the decades in various areas of the American Midwest.
Right. Yeah, and the I know the Scientific Technical Unit of Interplanetary Phenomenon, the group that he was a part of, that was the group that actually, I think it was Colonel Corso mentioned, was the one that investigated Roswell initially, that had been established just a few years earlier, with some incidents with UFOs out in California when all this began. So if he was part of that organization, I think he certainly definitely was privy to a lot of this information, a lot of things that were going on at the time and throughout his career to become a part of that organization. Yeah.
Well, that's right. Yes, I mean the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. I mean that is a legendary unit, and it did exist. I mean, there's documentation that shows that it did exist. It was created by the U.S. Army Intelligence Division. It goes back, I think, as far as 1942. Apparently, soon after the Los Angeles air raid incident. In February of 1942, that the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was created, and they were involved in investigating various UFO crash sites. The most prominent was the Roswell crash, and your father says, grandfather says, he was a counterintelligence officer with the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, out of Washington D.C. So that's pretty powerful testimony, given his background.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a part of that was he claimed to be a part of Project Blue Book. So I think that was kind of where he had access to the information, but then he was told in the military capacity to the not just the civilians. Like Dr. J. Allen Hynek was, of course, supposed to kind of debunk the UFO subject and things, and they're basically supposed to say, what you saw, you didn't see, it was swamp gas, it was something else. Well, his role was to say that within the military community of anybody that saw anything and say, you didn't see what you really saw. And then he explained in the book and also in interviews he's done that there was another group after that would come in if you kept talking, that would threaten you and give you all sorts of reasons why you should keep quiet. And then a third and would actually kill you if you wouldn't stop talking. So that's interesting.
So yeah, we know he had his first UFO sighting in 1949, 2 years after he joined the Air Force. So that would have been logical that soon after that sighting, he was recruited into the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit and became a key person in how the Air Force was handling UFO sightings with Project Blue Book that was created in 1952. So that is consistent with what his background and his credentials and his expertise.
Yep.
So you're going to say something else?
There was one other thing that he claimed that in his, I don't know, maybe not in the official capacity, because I guess there's no record of it, but he claimed to be a Chief Conrad courier for President Eisenhower, which is you carry the launch codes, the nuclear codes, in a suitcase or some briefcase, and there's always two of you, and you always have to deliver those codes together. And it's obviously anytime the president has to officially say there's a launch nuclear war or whatever, they have to get the right codes to know that it is a true order, or that is a true order from the president. So that he did claim to be a part of that group. So I think that also was giving some acknowledgement or recognition of where he was in those levels of security.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely his background makes it very, very clear that he was someone that was trusted by the people running the extraterrestrial phenomenon and the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit. Now, we know that so he served with distinction in the Air Force. He's with the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, which was the Army intelligence and then the Air Force's intelligence branch that managed the whole extraterrestrial phenomenon. And the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit was very active in terms of different UFO crashes and sightings. So this is where the National Reconnaissance Office comes in. So he retires in 1969, and he's recruited by the National Reconnaissance Office. And you mentioned that license plate, and I thought that was very interesting because interesting backstory. There's an interesting backstory to that, that kind of like supports what he said, that he was recruited by the National Reconnaissance Office for over a decade. So tell us the backstory behind that license plate.
I can just remember him. He actually did have that license plate on the Suburban, that when I'd go out and visit him in Taos in the summers as a kid, that I do remember that on his Suburban. So I don't know how he got away with having a license plate like that without getting in trouble, but I do remember seeing that as a kid. That's for sure.
And you said it was a retirement gift from the agency when he left. They let him have that. Is what he is how he said he got it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, right there, I mean, anyone can say that they work with the NRO. When I saw that license plate, I thought, well, is that a joke or something? I mean, but and something like that could be a joke, but you don't put a joke on your car, on your registration.
Yeah.
Because that's, you get the state police arresting you or citing you if you don't have a valid license plate. But the fact that he drove around with that and you saw it, that tells us that he really did work for the NRO, and that I think is pretty powerful corroborating evidence that that license plate that was real. You saw it and he drove around with that in the 90s in New Mexico.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so he did work with the NRO. You talked a little bit about the different units that the NRO used in investigating the UFO phenomenon. And so can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on his particular role with the NRO? I mean, with the Air Force, he was an electronic specialist. So with the NRO, what was it in particular? What skills did he have that they wanted to use?
I think it probably had a lot to do with the technology, electronics, his background. But he was involved with what Derek has mentioned before, particleization, UFO, or any. In his background in Project Blue Book, they also, he was involved with retrieval of UFO crashes and things like that. So he was kind of on both sides of that, in the reconnaissance part for the UFO technology, and then also the technology of the different systems that the NRO was involved with at the time.
Well, his book, the Life with the Cosmos Clearance, I mean, that has a wealth of documents in it where he talks about various leaked documents. They're called the majestic documents. And one thing that I know from my research in this field is that many people who have been privy to these classified programs that worked in them, if they release any classified documents, they will immediately be arrested and thrown into prison at best. If they
Right.
if they want to be kind. But what they can do is that they can refer to documents that have already been released into the public sphere and just talk about them, and not say anything that, well, I saw this in my NRO days. But if a document's been released into the public domain, you can talk about it as long as you're not the one releasing it. So you want to talk about that a little bit, about the documents that are in this book, Life with the Cosmos Clearance, why it's so important that he included those documents in the book.
Yeah, I think it gives a lot of credibility to his story, what he actually knew and where he went, who he knew where to go and reference some of these documents. But he had so much in the history of the German and the Nazi Third Reich, and the technology advancement that they were going through, and all the secret projects they were doing, all the occult aspect of it, the Brill and the Black Sun. And he just had a wealth of information on that topic. He went through talking about Schumann and his work that he did, and then Victor Schauber on the implosion type of technology instead of explosion. So of course that leads to the electrogravitic electropulsion systems and different ways of moving around these craft and the reproductive vehicles that the Germans were doing and creating.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the documentation also talks about the establishment of the MJ-12, Majestic 12, and what their role was, and letters from President Truman and various other political figures on how to deal with handling extraterrestrials at the time and controlling that information. So a lot of the documents in there are around that topic and what they were going through at the time, and the organization structure of the within the government, of how they handled all these. And a lot of, when I was a teenager, I mentioned he was had told me some things, and some of the stuff he told me about was Nazi bases on Antarctica, UFO technology down there. He mentioned that they were testing nuclear weapons and things like that. He told me about the Majestic 12, and this group was in charge of everything. So I was familiar with a lot of these terms when I later heard them in the 2000s with other things that I found on the internet. The Philadelphia experiment and time travel. He told me all about that. He actually showed me a VHS video of, it was black and white footage. It was of a UFO, and I don't know where it was from, or I don't recall the story behind it that he had, but I clearly remember that. a lot of these different topics that back in the 90s, I don't know, they may have been in the public domain, but not. It was not something you
didn't
find
have the internet for sure to go and search for that.
So it wasn't like you just look it up,
Well, that German connection is very interesting. I mean, of course, people are very familiar with the German UFO phenomenon, that they built these Hannibal craft and that they were being used in various projects that were trying to be kind of weaponized in time to win the war. But of course, the Germans didn't succeed because the technology was just too advanced, but yet they were able to relocate it to Antarctica. Now, this is where it gets very interesting because, of course, Nazi Germany was run by the Nazi SS, but the Antarctica project was run by another organization, well, by the secret societies, which included the Black Sun Society. And that was very interesting because it showed that there was this kind of occult nationalist group in Germany that ran the secret programs that were kind of like working through the Nazi SS, because the Nazi SS, that was the symbol there, that the Black Sun. If you go to, I think it's called Wewelsburg Castle, probably mangled the pronunciation there. I believe it's in Bavaria. You see that was the Nazi SS headquarters. They had that Black Sun, and that's an ancient symbol, but it represents this kind of like, as the name suggests, the Black Sun energy. So the Nazis, the Nazi secret space program was run by the occult, and it increasingly relocated to Antarctica. Whereas the Nazi SS, I mean, they were responsible for the war, and ultimately that was unsuccessful. So, yeah, what did your grandfather say anything about that kind of difference between the Nazi SS and the German occult societies that were running these projects?
He went into a lot of detail about the esoteric organizations that formed the Vril Society, the Thule Society initially, and a lot of esoteric stuff were going on there in those organizations that kind of fascinated Hitler and the Nazi government at that time, and kind of really fueled a lot of the technology and things that were going on. And yes, but he framed it so that it was clear that they were not so much interested in the the war efforts by the SS so much as just having this technology and moving their unit down to Antarctica was their primary focus, and they kind of left the SS and Hitler to handle the rest of it. Yep.
What did he have to say about the Freemasons? I mean, the Masonic Society and the extraterrestrial issue is a very important one historically, and even more so today. So, did your grandfather say anything about the Freemasons?
Yeah. He claimed to be. He was a Mason. I guess we know that for sure because we have the apron. My brother, I think, has the apron in his storage of the Masonic apron that he used or that he had, and also our mom was in the for women. I think it's I don't know. It's something of the star, Eastern Star, the group of the Eastern Star. That's what the women or females or daughters would go into. So she does remember being in that group. We don't know what level he was, but in the book he claimed that his great grandfather was a 33rd degree Mason. So you can see why being a part of that type of organization would help you to get in, have access to these other levels of secrecy within the military. And he did talk heavily about that and their influence in these the Masons, of course, the esoteric mystery schools and all the ancient knowledge that they used, some for good, some for not so good purposes. So, I mean, there are those factions and levels of secrecy all throughout the government, of course.
Yeah, that seems to be the two tracks in the classified world in terms of having access to these extraterrestrial related projects. Either you have need to know access because you're just so brilliant, or you're just so you have the necessary expertise that gives you need to know, particular area of a classified project, whatever that is. And on the other hand, if you rise to like 33rd degree status in the Freemasons, you also have access to these technologies, and you might not be in the military, but because you're a 33 degree Freemason, you can walk right into like, what is it, Hangar 17 at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and you can get in. Whereas if you're a member of the general public, you'll be shot if you try to do that. And that seems to be the two. That seems to be, even presidents can't get into these facilities. But either you have need to know because of merit, or you're like a 33 degree Freemason and above, and you can get in. So, you want to elaborate on that?
I think that's an important distinction that people need to realize. It doesn't matter what your military rank is. The rank has nothing to do with what your security level clearance could be. Either you have a need to know or you don't. So I think that was a big part of how they were structured. It was so compartmentalized that you might be working on just one piece of a much bigger project and not even know what you're truly working on at the end of the day. I know the CIA, of course, is definitely, it has that level of secrecy and compartmentalization. And I'm sure people at lower levels don't know what they're really working on. But yeah, I see that as part of the reason why you get those clearances, and maybe having that access to the Masonic thing as well, it gets you in quicker.
Yeah, and even if like family members were, like his great grandfather was a 33rd degree Mason, if they have knowledge of that, the history within your family, that also has some credibility to them wanting to potentially recruit those people. Derek, I think you would want to tell about when you were contacted by the CIA.
Yeah, I was looking for work. It was in like 2015, 2016, and it was interesting because I got a phone call and they claimed to be the CIA, and it was a recruiter. It was actually a female, sound like a younger female that was trying to, get people to join. And she mentioned about the position would be as an operations officer, and I would have to do a lot of intense training, or combat training, things like that. It would take a few years, but I think she was alluding to I'd go to some undisclosed place within the U.S. and train, kind of like they call it the farm, I think, in the CIA. There's a place where you do the training. So some place like that, I'd have to also be screened heavily for my background to get in, officially get in and go. But they picked me, who I'm sure maybe because for one of our grandfather, and maybe they knew that, I'm sure, but also I had been traveling quite a lot for work. So they try to target those that maybe will be able to fit into a job that seems just normal to their career and to their background. But at the end of the day, you're actually working for the CIA. So they actually said you would likely be going down to some South American country. And I had a feeling it'd probably be Venezuela. And I knew it's probably not somewhere I'd want to live, but the pay isn't great. I knew that for sure. And I was like, I don't think I would want to risk my life for this. But they to give more credibility to that, they would say, hey, okay, if you want to know about this position, go to the local library. Don't look on the internet. Don't use any of your personal devices. Go to the library on the computer and look up the position. You can learn all about it. If you want to learn about the pros and cons, you can read this book that gives you a lighter side of what it's like. You can read this book that gives you like some more dangerous, treacherous things that you do. But they said pay with cash, don't pay with card, things like that. So there's little reasons that made me believe this was definitely a real, they were really trying to get me in there. And I think at the end of the day, after a couple of phone conversations, they were like, well, you can't tell obviously anybody in your family except maybe your wife after you've been married for a while. But other than that, nobody can know. And I was just like, I don't think I could do that. I don't think I could live a life that way. And I'm sure they could tell by my responses that I probably wasn't made fit for the job, or probably I wouldn't be a good liar. Let's put it that way. So they say no. They didn't contact me after that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that does confirm that the agencies are looking for people who, through some kind of generational connection, they suspect can probably be trusted with keeping secrets. And yeah, okay. So just to clarify, with your grandfather, when you say great grandfather was a Mason, are we talking about his father, or his father, which is your great grandfather, or his great grandfather, which would, I guess, be your great 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 grandfather?
Yeah, I believe it was his great grandfather he was claiming. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
So that goes quite a ways back. I mean, and he was German lineage, but from the Revolutionary War period. And actually, our father, our dad, was able to find the family. He did a lot of research for our family tree, and when that was one of the lineages he could trace farthest back, as far as a letter that his relative, our grandfather's relative, distant relative, had of writing back to Germany, saying that he was in the Revolutionary War, that he's okay, some kind of communication happening back then. So that was pretty interesting to have that. Yeah.
That is interesting. So there's some kind of Germanic connection there in the ancestral chain. One of the things that I found very interesting in the book, I mean, it's in his book, is his reference to the Adamski sighting, where he talked about this famous set of photographs by George Adamski, where you see a succession of objects coming out of a scout craft, and George Adamski was, of course, made famous because of his later books where he talked about meeting these Venusians, and but one of the things that was always strange to me was that
You're listening to
okay. Well, one of the things that was strange to me was when he first met Orthon. That was his first contact. Orthon couldn't speak, and to him that it was done all telepathically. So, this raised the question: was Orthon really an extraterrestrial from Venus, or was he part of a German secret space program? And your grandfather says that those craft were part of a German secret space program. So, yeah, what's your kind of take on that?
Yeah, I hadn't read. I read that chapter quite a while back. I just remember him saying, he really thought that whole case that George Adamski that whole story was a true story. That I think it was the minister or nephew of the minister of England that had really direct communications with Adamski and wrote many diaries about their relationship, and that Adamski could basically go into anywhere, into the White House, into the Vatican, and he would basically have access at wherever he went. He had some kind of pass or badge to get into these places and talk to these very high level officials. So he had something to say. Obviously, some communications he claimed to have with some other beings, whatever they were, and had a way to interact with the White House and the Vatican. And he got some special coin or metal that is only given to very, very well renowned people of high distinction, or for whatever reason, but they got that from the Pope. He got it from the Pope. So that was something interesting. I remember from the story. He had a really strange belly button as well. So he talked about this the belly button went in quite deep. It was very, very deep, and it was like a starburst shape. There's a lot of interesting things about that story from what I remember in the book.
Yeah, and I wish we could have talked to our grandfather more after the book was published. He was having strokes at the time before he passed, so it was very difficult to communicate with him, and we didn't really know much about the book to start with, so we weren't really able to have those conversations and elaborate on the content that much. But that would have been really interesting to get his take on a lot of these things that he brings up.
Yeah. Well, he brought up a number of majestic documents that I thought were very interesting. Quite a few of them. So, one that I found particularly interesting was the one on Einstein, Albert Einstein, and Robert Oppenheimer's draft document on, quote, relations with inhabitants of celestial bodies. So that
Yeah.
was a document that they wrote. So, what did your grandfather have to say about that particular document?
It was interesting. It kind of tied into a lot of what he had said about, they expressed concern, or Einstein expressed concern in this letter about them potentially being a threat, and that they knew that they didn't want to use atomic weapons in any kind of manner with these extraterrestrials, and that he talks a lot about how the ETs have warned us several times about putting nuclear weapons in space against that, and we refuse to listen. And they, I mean, that's where they've really shown their force throughout history of making sure that we do not move forward with that. So it was interesting to see this letter to where they're talking, acknowledging back then, 1947, that there definitely is an alien presence, and they need to figure out how they're going to address it and how the government's going to address it. And they're mostly worried about the nuclear weapons in the end,
And it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting too. I noticed that it kind of explains what, like, a certain prime directive, and it's kind of from the viewpoint of us now that we know that there could be interaction or contact, that we need to have these official rules, or galactic rules, when interacting with other species. And it's I don't know whether to take it as assuming that there was all this interaction before or during the 40s or even earlier, that maybe they had really been in contact already and gotten these rules into being established, and they kind of had to put something in perspective into official documents, right?
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting document, because it does kind of indicate that even back in the late 40s, I think that was 1949, as I recall, that document came out, that there was already an attempt to kind of work out, what would be the ground rules for diplomatic relations with extraterrestrial visitors. So, and you got your, two of the best minds on the planet, supposedly Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer, to come up with some draft, just fleshing out the principles of diplomatic relations. So, and obviously your grandfather thought that this was a genuine document. So, yeah, that's good to know.
And Oppenheimer does say in the document at the end, it mentions that perhaps the reason why this activity is happening is because of the fact that we started using nuclear weapons in the first place, and that's likely a reason for more interaction with these beings.
Yeah, that they may be potentially disturbing the universe in ways that we're not aware of.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other documents that he talked about was this one, the Special Operations Manual, SOM1, Extraterrestrial Entities and Technology Recovery and Disposal. So and that's classified Majestic 12. So you want to kind of tell us, anything you know about his perspective on that particular document.
It seems like it basically lays the ground rules for the Majestic 12 and how UFO information is handled, specifically calling out that it's not permitted to discuss it in any nature, discloses to the public, and even Forrestal, who was an original member of the Majestic 12, was later taken out because of this, because his intent was to share this information. So it just goes to show how serious they took it.
And I think he was trying to connect the dots. If you can see on one of the pages within the MJ12 document, it shows the history. It quickly says the history and the year and the date of and when it officially got started, and then the memo that Truman wrote to Secretary Forrestal is actually the same date, dated the same date, where he's saying all of this information related to UFOs should basically be kept between myself, you, Dr. Forrestal, and Dr. Vannevar Bush, and Director of Central Intelligence. And that was the same date that memo was written. So that's kind of interesting. I think he's putting those pieces together for people to see how that was the beginning of MJ12. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's that famous memo from President Truman to the Secretary of Defense, And yeah, it shows that the Majestic project was created in 1947, and it was under it was being run out of the White House, or out of the Department of Defense. And yeah, that's a very significant document. Again, it's something that your grandfather thought was genuine, and certainly his background. I mean, interesting. He would have been in the Air Force at the time all of this was being drafted and implemented. Now, what I find very interesting about the Special Operations Manual document was that this was actually dated 1954. So at that time, your grandfather would have been in the Army, sorry, in the Air Force for five years, and that was drafted with all of the procedures for these crash retrieval operations. So, you know, it does raise the possibility: could he have been involved in the drafting of that?
That was after his first encounter, so it may. I mean, he may have been aware of it. I mean, how involved? I don't know, but yeah, certainly.
Because I can't imagine there would have been too many people, you know, who had
Right.
kind of hands-on experience with UFOs, had seen them, was working with the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit, and then you have to come up with a manual for working out exactly how to handle these crash retrieval operations. And that manual would have been given to a non-commissioned officer. And you know, your grandfather ended up as a chief master sergeant major. So it's he would have had the skill set to put together a manual like this. So yeah, it's an interesting possibility.
It's a very good point. He said in his clearance, he claims that he had the Cosmos level clearance, which is like 38 levels above top secret. He said there was only maybe 25 people at the time that had that knowledge that was at that security level. So it's a very small group when you think about it. So the likelihood of his knowledge or involvement would probably be highly likely. When you think about it.
Yeah.
There's actually one of the images is of a UFO wrecking diagram or chart of what the UFOs look like or appeared like so far, all the sightings, and he claimed, I mean, he just says it right under the image that this was used as a chart, as a reference for any sightings that they see between the Air Force and the CIA. So somehow he knew that was used in that capacity way back then. I might have sent it to you actually through a separate email. It was the second email I sent, but yeah, it showed that.
Okay, so he may have been involved in the creation of the kind of manual, the authoritative manual for crash retrieval operations, but he was familiar with them at the very least. And he talked about one famous one in South Africa in the Kalahari Desert. Mm-hmm. So, what do you know about that particular UFO crash?
Yeah, that was part of in the beginning of the book. He did claim that we did get a lot of our technology from those crashes. I'm sure, of course, he knew of Roswell and how that was tied into it. But he said those crashes in the Kalahari Desert were also very significant, to say the least. But he, at the same time, and I think, yeah, at the same time, he's talking about the technology in general. I think he brings up, it just reminds me of the topic of particleization and void to mass, and then also Elizabeth Clearer, who wrote Beyond the Light Barrier, and she was a contactee within South Africa, and I think he holds that of significance, and her all the information she shared till her death in '94, I guess. So very interesting. She had been, I know you've talked about that, Dr. Sala, and how she had a particular contactee with the being from, I forget which star system or where it was, but Akon, maybe it was his name. So that's interesting. She had so much information, mathematics, how the universe worked, how light, changes in frequency. Everything's basically light and changes in frequency, similar to what Tesla always said. And if you change those frequency rates, you can even you can even take time out of the equation and end up from one part of the universe to the other. And all the physics that we're trying to still understand right now, or that are probably hidden from us. So.
Right. She had contact with beings from Proxima Centauri, and she worked with South African intelligence during the Second World War, and was active after the Second World War with the South African intelligence. So I suspect, given your grandfather's involvement with the Interplanetary Phenomenon Unit and their kind of work in finding extraterrestrial craft that had crashed, and then later with the NRO, that maybe he may have gotten to work with her directly, or at least would have been very familiar with her case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I don't know if we can see this on, but this is the. No, it's not going to work. Sorry, I had that image you were talking about, Derek, from the Majestic document with the different types of craft that they were looking for in the retrievals.
Right. Now another thing, Dr. Sala, that I don't know if you'll get to the deep underground military bases and Phil Schneider's story, but I can tell you that just what you were saying about trying to be careful about what information you show to the public domain, and if you had this background and knowledge, well, he did claim that he was friends with Phil Schneider towards the end, and the fact that they exchanged information. They met in DC at some point and started to exchange information and learned a lot from each other. What one had, the other one didn't know, and they really had a good bond and friendship towards the end. And I remember seeing a VHS tape of Phil Schneider when visiting in Towson in the mid to late 90s. So I know a grandfather was, bringing people into the house and showing this tape and showing the significance of that. And Phil Schneider's story, of course, that he was the one engineer, a geoengineer that was working on building the tunnels, and he ended up in an interaction with the aliens, the Greys, and ended up getting shot with some beam ray gun, and that's why he ended up getting cancer. He had a disfigured hand, and so basically he had cancer. So my grandfather said in the book, I just read that part, it's funny you find the gems like this. And he said, yeah, he was great friends with Phil, but Phil knew he was going to die, so he wasn't being careful at all. He said, well, I'm already dying, so I might as well get this information out as fast as possible. So that shows you the difference between our grandfather trying to be a little bit more cautious and Phil Schneider's case, where he was obviously killed.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I know that you mentioned your grandfather started talking in 1993 after his retirement from the NRO, and Phil Schneider burst onto the scene in 1995, and I think it was in January of 1996 that he was found strangled to death in his apartment, and people that knew him said that there was no way that he would have done that to himself, and he was he had warned people that that he was not suicidal, that if that he was found dead, it was because they took him out. But as you said, he just kind of went he just kind of really took to revealing everything he knew about the Dulce base. And of course, the Dulce base is this kind of multi-level, 7-story deep underground military base that's very famous in the literature. So you want to maybe talk a little bit more? Well, maybe what did your grandfather say about Phil Schneider and his kind of experiences at Dulce and elsewhere that kind of stood out for you as significant?
Dan, do you remember any direct conversations you had with him?
Not about he mentioned underground bases, but no specifics with Phil Schneider. Didn't he take you to Dulce one time?
Yeah, I was about to say, this is the way our grandfather was. I mean, and maybe he was being protective of us as part of his family. He, especially with me, he never really went heavy into detail on any of these subjects. He said, of course, we're not alone in the universe. There's aliens that have been around forever, and we've interacted with, and he actually called me a star. I was a star child when I was very, very little. So before I get to the Dulce story, because I do have a direct event that happened with me and my grandfather there, but he did call me a star child, and I'm not sure why, but I asked my mom, why did he do that? Why did he say that? And this was before that term was really thrown out there. And it was because we moved to a new home, a new town, and my grandfather had visited right at the same time. And he just took me for a drive, and he basically said, okay, well, I want to find out, let's go to the cemetery. Let's try to find the local cemetery. And he would just say, okay, tell me which direction to go. And I would, I would just say left or right, or we started driving, and apparently we found the cemetery easy enough. So he just told my mom, that must be one of the reasons. But I think it's not like I have those abilities now, but as a kid, like 5 or 6, I think everybody has those abilities in them. And then over time, we start to maybe lose them, and we get indoctrinated in a way. So who knows? That was just an interesting side story, but we would take drives all the time. And it's so interesting that as a teenager in Taos, and he'd take me up to Colorado Springs. He wanted me to be part of the Air Force. He really wanted me to go to the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. So I was, of course, enthusiastic about flying and doing that. But he would never go into these subjects very deeply. We would have long pauses, just driving down the road. And I remember we'd go to Dulce or drive through Dulce because he knew that was significant and he wanted to show that to me. But, a lot of times that we wouldn't say much. And then I'd say stuff like, wow, you can really think a lot out here. So he told my mom like that was profound that I would say a statement like that as a kid. But the fact was, when we got to Dulce, he said, this is a pretty important place. And he was alluding to the underground base. He didn't go into much detail, but as we're driving and getting closer, he said, this is the area right here. If you see that mesa, this is kind of the area where all this interaction took place. And I think, I'm not sure how much he told me about Phil Snyder, but he was alluding to that. And as soon as we got there into that area, unmarked SUVs started coming up behind us. And I think, there was one behind us, or maybe one in front too, and just kind of showing us, hey, you probably shouldn't be here. And my grandfather said right away, okay, that's our sign to get out of here. So we're just going to keep going. But that was an instance I remember. So of course he knew a lot about Dulce. And I'll say this is an interesting story. As one of the times I was out in Taos, and I want to share it because, if I don't share all these experiences that I had, then it just kind of, I want people to understand that life isn't always what you think it is, and the reality that we're taught. And this instance happened to me outside of our grandfather's home, middle of the night. It was 3 a.m, and I was with somebody. I was with a friend, and we're just going down the highway. He lived in Pot Creek, which is just outside of Taos, towards the mountains. So we went to the highway. We looked up on top of the hill where the full moon was, and that was towards the mountains. So we just started walking that direction, and we both looked. And once we looked up there, we saw that there was this silhouette of some image of something coming at us, and it was like basically running towards us. And we know what, you know what a deer looks like, what a bear looks like. And we saw this thing, and it looked like it was basically upright, and it seemed to have a tail, because we could see that it was moving behind it and swaying behind it as it was kind of hobbling or running towards us. And it was still quite a long ways away, but that was something that we did encounter, and we both looked at it, and we both were just like, let's go, we got to get out of here as fast as we can. So that did happen, and I put it out of my mind for a long time, but it was basically like a giant lizard that it seemed to be coming towards us. So who knows? Like I said, you go through life, you might have an experience like that and completely block it out of memory, because how do you fit it into your day-to-day life? But after researching more and more and looking at all this information our grandfather had, that kind of ties into a lot of this information about the reptilians and these things. And he never mentioned reptilians directly to me, but he mentioned the Greys all the time. So, and how that, and he had videos about the Greys in a lot of depth and detail. So, yeah.
Well, it's very interesting that he befriended Phil Schneider, because it sounds like he was one of those people, because it seems that a lot of people who have gone through the projects and then retire, a lot of them just walk away from it, and they just do retirement things, and that's it. And they're not going to talk about it. They carry the secrets to the grave. And others, like your grandfather, they become active and they seek out others who have had similar experiences, because they're trying to connect the dots. They're trying to get the big picture, because now they've got a big slice of the picture, but now they're wanting to get other people's perspective, and they're trying to connect it all, because that seems to be really what we need most in the general public, is people who are familiar with certain projects, connecting the dots to other projects and forming friendships, so you get the overall big picture, rather than trying to just use one perspective and try and extrapolate from that. So your grandfather was clearly someone trying to do that, and his book, Life with the Cosmos Clearance, I think it really is an important book, because it does represent someone with a very strong background in this area, connecting the dots by working with or talking about other people who have had similar experiences, but in very different projects.
He was very passionate about sharing information to wake up humanity, and we've seen videos of him in the 90s where he was kind of doing just that, trying to connect the dots for people and make sure that we're not being fooled generation after generation again by our governments, and it was really important to him, and that's why it's important to us as well to carry on his legacy and do what we can to let people know what's happening, and the more we know, the better off we'll be.
He really was more spiritually, on that spiritual side, at least towards the end. And he had some Native American in him, so he kind of took that more seriously and saw the value and the traditions of the Native Americans, indigenous, and how that their prophecy, the Hopi prophecy, and all these things are starting to come true. And if we don't take care of Mother Gaia and Mother of Earth, then of course it's gonna start showing us more earthquakes, more things like that, things that were prophesied even by Edgar Cayce and Nostradamus even. But these don't necessarily have to be our future. It's just the possible outcomes if we continue down the road we're down. So he was very much trying to tell people, we need to wake up, and we need to wake up fast. And he's very much a proponent of that. And just to tell you, I guess a couple other people he connected with, Bill Cooper was one that he said that he was friends with, and they exchanged information. And I think I loved his information. And the Behold the Pale Horse, I really was a follower of Bill Cooper, and we know that he was killed after disclosing 9/11 and Osama bin Laden as the scapegoat and everything else. So he did say that what our grandfather did in the Air Force, he said what I guess what Bill Cooper did in the Navy is what he did for the Air Force, is how he explained it. So.
Yeah. His book is actually published by the same company that Bill Cooper used for his book as well. So I think they definitely had a connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, just love the fact that your grandfather was working with these other pioneers, or these other very brave whistleblowers, because that's what they were. Phil Schneider, William Cooper, your grandfather, others, Clifford Stone's another more recent one, that these guys were all very brave and out there sharing the information, and your grandfather was befriending them and sharing their information, and that's great that he knew William Cooper as well as Phil Schneider. One of the really mysterious organizations in this whole puzzle concerning UFOs is the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization. Now, your grandfather worked for the National Reconnaissance Office after leaving the Air Force, and the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization is supposed to be part of the National Security Agency. So what do you know, or what did your grandfather share with you about the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization?
He was the only one that I'm aware of from the Disclosure Project, and that had mentioned that organization. And he said that they would help governments basically act as an interface with extraterrestrials and give them knowledge. They were the main interface for alien contact on the planet, and governments could work with them to gain more access to information. I don't know, potentially making deals with them of some kind. But
Yeah.
they were kind of the authority in the realm of all of that. Is how he kind of positioned it.
And he said in a video once, while he was still kind of obviously in his right mind in the 90s, he did say, and actually was as part of the Disclosure Project video that he had in his testimony, and he said, if you pay your dues and you follow the rules, and then he kind of laughed, and it's like, then your government can benefit from that organization's information. So he knew that was a very highly secretive group, organization, and how much he might have interacted with them, we're still trying to determine that. And we might have more information later, but there's a lot of speculation of how that organization fits and who's involved and what's their agenda. Because I think at all levels, these organizations and agencies might have an agenda, but there are a lot of factions within every agency, and you never know what's happening, truly, when it's compartmentalized like that.
Right. One of the projects or material that is linked to the Advanced Contact Intelligence Organization is the Wingmakers material. So what did your grandfather know about the Wingmakers? Did he have any insight into that?
In his book, he describes the ancient NRO project in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico, and the time capsule, the various chambers that were discovered there. And he goes into a little bit of detail about, the ACI's involvement in handling that. And it was very interesting, the whole Wingmaker story. There's a lot of stuff online that people can find out about that, but it's extremely elaborate.
It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, that was the first time I ever heard of it was from his book. He kind of introduced us to it. So it was, and I guess supposedly there's other sites like the Ancient NRO site in Chaco Canyon that have other time capsules that are were put there, over 800 years ago, I believe, to help humanity kind of evolve spiritually. And that was the goal of them. I'm not sure. You don't hear a lot from the ACIO about what the other sites look like or where they are. I think I've seen some information about where some of the locations of those, but not in the depth of the Ancient NRO site.
And Dr. Saul, I was going to say, I know you've done a lot of work recently too on the Transylvania Sunrise series and the Busege Mountains, and I didn't know if you think that projection hall might be tied to the same capsules or parts of that, the same discussion, I guess, regarding the Wingmakers.
Right, yeah, that Transylvania book series talking about the Busege Hall of Records, I mean, that does put out that information that there's a series of these ancient sites around the planet that are connected through this series of tunnels and portals. So they're all over the planet. So yeah, this ancient NRO site with the time capsule, it would be part of that pattern of these kind of like, clearly there are different extraterrestrial groups, underground civilizations that are all trying in their different ways to kind of influence the evolution of our civilization at this point. And, whether it's through releasing technologies or just kind of helping us reconnect with the ancient history, they all seem to be doing something different. And I guess an organization like the ACO would be trying to work out exactly what something like this ancient NRO site it was trying to achieve. Of course, the Busege Mountains, we know that the Freemasons and US military were very much involved in exploring that when that was discovered in 2003. So yeah, definitely connections between all these.
Yeah, I'm actually reading that series now, and it's so fascinating. But a lot of ties and a lot of disclosure that needs to be heard now. And I think there's a reason why it's coming out now, for sure.
There's one other diagram that was in the book that your grandfather showed, which was something I saw Colonel Steve Wilson, who was part of Project Pounce, talked about. That was the Star Wars city, that kind of organization chart, and probably hard to tell. But there you have a kind of organizational flow chart for the different government entities and how they relate to this whole extraterrestrial phenomenon. So you want to talk about that Star Wars city chart?
Yeah, Dan, go. If you want to.
Oh yeah, he talks a lot in the book about this and how all the organizations are interrelated. You can see the NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, is up there near the top with the Magi Majestic 12 organization, and then you have all your your defense contractors, Lockheed, Boeing, and the like. He talks about Rockefeller Company being involved with the Japanese company down there, Fujika, and that was really the tie to the media censorship and controlling the media and the narrative that we have around the UFO phenomenon and who gets to know and what the story is going to be for the public. So it's really all the intelligence agencies that are involved with UFO contact and how they interrelate and who's involved. And it was he goes into a lot of detail about it actually in the chapters of what they do and what their roles were. So
this is basically a great interpretation of the military-industrial complex.
Exactly. Essentially, the military. This is a military-industrial complex as it was being established, in the 80s through the Star Wars program, the Strategic Defense Initiative was the cover, for that.
Right. Yeah. Very helpful to kind of like have that flow chart to kind of give us an idea of how in the 80s and 90s the military-industrial complex handled the kind of extraterrestrial phenomena. Now, of course, we're like 25 years or more since that time, so maybe there's been further reorganization with the creation of Space Command and Space Force, and
sure,
and you have the Artemis Accords, and there's kind of like a growing international alliance of space commands. So probably very, very different today. So your grandfather was part of the Disclosure Project, and I thought it was very interesting. He was supposed to speak at the Disclosure Project press conference, but didn't. Even though we have his testimony in the Disclosure Project conference book Stephen Greer put together, but he didn't speak. So can you maybe relate what happened to him at that time?
Yeah. So Dan, we actually spoke with Dan Willis. He was one of the first guests we interviewed on our show, Shred the Veil, and this has been a year or so, a year and a half ago, I think by now. But Dan Willis actually remembers sitting down, having breakfast with their grandfather, or meeting him and talking with him while they were there. They were both obviously at the press club hearing in 2001. And so Dan was saying how, by the time he was about to go to the podium and say something, he got there, he was about to speak, and he kind of froze up, and he kind of did this shrill and really got scared and spooked. And so they just had to walk him assist him off. But Dan said he just seemed terrified. And we know from our mom that he left early from the press club hearing, that he seemed to be very anxious and kind of afraid of sticking around. He just said, I don't want to be here anymore. Come and get me. So my mom got him early after that. So we don't really know what happened, but you can imagine that you might just think it was just, nervousness, or maybe he felt like he was really being somehow targeted, because we know from his book, he explains all the psyops and the things that they can do. And especially, they can get into your head if they wanted to. They had that technology, and he talked about it in the book quite a lot. So maybe that had something to do with why he deteriorated so fast. He already had a few mini strokes before that press club hearing. So he already looked pretty bent out of shape by then. So,
and I did I have been in contact with Nancy Red Star, who helped write the book, and she mentioned that she felt that he certainly did hold back information, and there was certainly a fear of what he could disclose and not disclose. So as we mentioned, him knowing Bill Cooper, Phil Schneider, and saw their fate, when they came out with things, I'm sure that was very intimidating, and very could have been a little panic attack he had there or something, with that kind of what he was prepared to say and do. And but I'm grateful that Dr. Greer was able to get some of the disclosure stuff in his book from our grandfather on the DVD sets as well. You can see him giving us some testimonies. But yeah, I do believe he did hold back a lot of the information that he truly did have, even within the book, out of fear.
Right. Well, given his level of access and what the secrets that he knew, that he was in a position to reveal, I mean, there could have been people in that audience that he may have recognized. Because I know in the book, he talks about the killers from the NSA and the Wackenhut Corporation, and maybe he saw some of these people there, and that kind of like frightened him. I mean, that would be very natural.
It's possible. I actually met Dr. Greer briefly at the premiere of the Sirius, his first big movie, Sirius, that came out in 2013, I believe. And I was in LA to try to get more information from Dr. Greer, because I knew that the DVDs came out with his testimony that was pre-recorded before the press club hearing, and then you get everybody else speaking there. But we knew at least they had unedited versions of what he talked about from all the testimony that he did. So I tried to ask Dr. Greer, and he kind of shrugged me off. He was kind of busy with his entourage at the after party. So I tried contacting through email. I haven't been too successful. But David Wilcock was there at the time, and I briefly met him. And I knew, of course, I read some of his books, and the one that really was popular, the source field investigations, and then there's many others. But he actually did reference our grandfather a few times in some of his books. But at the time, I didn't know he actually interviewed our grandfather at the press club hearing. So I got to meet him and shake his hand and say thanks for all that you're doing and you're in the disclosure world. But then afterwards, I realized, oh wow, he actually interviewed our grandfather. I wish I could have known that, so I could have asked him back then. So we met him again in 2019 at the Contact in the Desert, and that's where I met you, actually, Dr. Sala, for the first time. And you signed my book. I have a signed copy of our grandfather's book that I got you to sign, and David Wilcock signed it. But we only had a minute or few seconds to shake his hand because he had all the security there. And we were like, hey, you obviously you knew our grandfather. He said, yeah, I remember your grandfather, but we haven't been able to get his take either on what he disclosed, what was disclosed there. So lots of other connections.
Right. So what's next for you? I know you have been trying to get more records on your grandfather, hopefully through the Freedom of Information Act, get something from the NRO. You've approached the National Archives. So what do you hope to get, by approaching government agencies through the Freedom of Information Act?
Yeah, we would hope to get at least some record of him being part of the NRO. But the one correspondence I did get back, and I've tried multiple times and, get either no response or some reason why I have to go and resubmit my application or something like that. But the NRO specifically came back and said there are no official NRO documents that relate to our grandfather. So meaning maybe whatever capacity he was in, it all ties back to his Air Force career and intelligence. And I'm sure that if they didn't want to disclose it, I don't think they really have to. I don't know. I think there's a way. They probably did some way around that just by the way they answered the question. But we'll see. We'll see if we can come up with anything else.
Yeah, we would love to further validate, everything from his book and that he discusses in his experiences. By any means we can, if we are able to get a hold of ever, the videos from Dr. Greer of the unedited footage, or correspondence with David Wilcock, or whatever it happens to be, just to get more clarity around it, and it would be really nice for us.
Yeah, that's great that you're doing this. I think it's very important. Your grandfather's testimony is vital to understanding, much of the history of how the system was set up and what happened, and anything you can find about him is very important. So I know you got a show, Shred the Veil, or a podcast. So why don't you tell us about that, and where can people find you if they want to learn more?
So yeah, we've been doing our show, like Derek said, for about a year and a half on Infinite TV, infinite.tv, and it's called Shred the Veil, and we interview a wide range of guests talking about disclosure, talking about UFO extraterrestrial involvement, spirituality, really trying to, as I mentioned before, carry on our grandfather's legacy of, just like the show says, shred the veil of the narrative the mainstream narrative that we've seen, and get behind the scenes to find out what's really happening. Just give people this knowledge that they can, take it or leave it. At least, they've been exposed to it and they can make their own decisions from there. But I think the more knowledge that's out there and the more opportunity people have to see it, the better off humanity will be with the truth.
Yeah, and I was going to add just we have our own story and our own journey that got us to where we are now, and it seemed like being a part of that show and that community, the platform on infinite.tv, just came so natural. And actually, the conference Contact in the Desert in 2019 was really where it jump started, meeting Laura Eisenhower, and we have to really give praise to Laura and all she's done, because she's so humble and modest, and she's selfless, and she really helps the community grow and tries to give all of her energy really to the movement. And so we thank Laura more than anything, and keeping the contacts and connection with her. But everything seemed to flow, and it seemed to be so synchronistic, all these things that have happened for us over the years. And it kind of just, it really, I guess, escalated rapidly in the last few years. So I actually wanted to mention that our grandfather went to a conference, and one of his notes, and we know that he met Alex Collier in person, or went to one of those conferences when Alex just started in the early 90s. And so I got to finally meet Alex in person at the last conference, well, the two last conferences he did in Mount Shasta and the GISIC last year in Orlando. So that was really a great achievement for me, or kind of a neat way to close out that connections from our grandfather. And we love Alex too, and I hope we can interview him at some point. I've talked to him, but I know he's a busy guy, so we'll see if he accepts our invitation.
Well, thank you both for everything you're doing, and kind of like bringing your grandfather's testimony into the public arena, and your own efforts to kind of connect the dots, find out more about what's going on, and help prepare the public for what lies ahead, which is huge. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for allowing us to share this with you. Appreciate it.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Sala. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Sala. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.